Avadim, Chapter 4. 1. A Hebrew maidservant is a girl below the age of majority sold by her father. When she manifests signs of physical maturity after reaching 12 years of age and becomes a Nara, he does not have the right to sell her, even though he still has authority over her and may consecrate her to whomever he desires. Even a girl who has already manifested physical signs that she is an islandess and thus not fit to manifest physical signs of maturity may be sold by her father as long as she is below majority. Neither a tumtum nor an androgynous may be sold as a Hebrew servant nor as a Hebrew maidservant. 2. A father may not sell his daughter as a maidservant unless he becomes impoverished to the extent that he owns nothing, neither landed property, movable property, not even the clothing that he is wearing. Nevertheless, we compel a father to redeem his daughter after he has sold her, because this is a blemish to the family. If the father fled, died, or did not have resources to redeem her, she must work until she is released. 3. A Hebrew maidservant is acquired through the payment of money or objects that are worth money, even though or through the transfer of a legal document. She may not be acquired for a pruta because it is necessary to acquire her with a sum that will allow her to reduce her price according to the number of years she has worked so that she can redeem herself and depart. How was she acquired through the transfer of a legal document? Her father should write to her master on a piece of paper or on a shard, "My daughter is sold to you," or "My daughter is acquired by you," and give it to the master. The deed of transfer of a Hebrew maidservant must be written by the father. 4. A Hebrew maidservant must work for 6 years like a servant sold by the court, as reflected by Deuteronomy 15:12. When your brother, a Jew or Jewess, will be sold to you, she receives the freedom at the beginning of the 7th year. If the Jubilee year falls in the middle of these 6 years, she is released as a male servant. If her master dies, she is released without payment, even if he leaves a son, as is a servant whose ear is pierced, as reflected by Deuteronomy 15:17. Even to your maidservant shall you do this. Similarly, she may be redeemed by paying a prorated figure that considers the time for which she served. If her master writes her a bill of release, and waives her service for the remainder of the time, she is released without charge, like a Hebrew servant. 5. A Hebrew maidservant has an advantage over a Hebrew servant in that she attains her freedom when she manifests physical signs of maturity. What is implied? She manifested signs of physical maturity and became a Nara. She is released and becomes free without charge. As Exodus 21:11 states, she will depart without charge. With this verse, the Torah granted her another cause for release beyond those granted to servants. And according to the oral tradition, it was taught that this refers to the manifestation of physical signs of maturity. This law applies even if she manifests signs of physical maturity on the day she was purchased. When a maidservant is released, she returns to her father's domain until she attains Bagros and leaves her father's domain. If the girl is an islandess who is not granted a period of Nara because directly into Bagros, when she attains Bagros, she is granted her freedom. 6. A Hebrew maidservant is not released until her prominent limbs are damaged, as implied by Exodus 21:7. She shall not depart as the servant depart. Similarly, a Hebrew servant is not released for such a reason. Instead, his master knocks out a tooth or blinds him in the eye. He should pay him as one must pay another colleague whom one injures, as explained in Hillchos Chayv L'Mazik. Thus, we have learned that a Hebrew maidservant is acquired through two means: the payment of money or the transfer of a legal document, and obtains her freedom through 6 means: the passage of 6 years, the advent of the Jubilee, paying a prorated amount for the purchase price, the transfer of a bill of release, the death of her master, and the manifestation of signs of physical maturity. 7. If the master of a Hebrew maidservant designates her as a wife for himself or for his son, she is like any other consecrated woman. She is not released because of any of the reasons mentioned above, but only because of the death of her husband or through a bill of divorce. The mitzvah of designating a maidservant as a wife takes precedence over the mitzvah of redeeming the maidservant. How is the mitzvah of designating a maidservant as a wife performed? The master tells the maidservant in the presence of two witnesses, "Behold, you are consecrated to me, you are betrothed to me, or behold, you are my wife." This may be done even at the conclusion of the 6 years of her servitude before the setting of the sun. She need not give her anything. For the first money were given with the intent that they could serve for the purpose of consecration. From this point onward, he must treat her as a wife, not as a servant. He may not designate two maidservants as wives at the same time. For Exodus 21:8 states, he will designate her. How does the master designate a maidservant as a wife for his son? If his son is past majority and grants his father permission to designate a maidservant as his wife, the father tells the maidservant in the presence of two witnesses, "Behold, you are consecrated to my son." 8. A master may not designate a maidservant as a wife or his son's wife without her knowledge. Although her father has already received money because of her, the Torah uses the term yada, which implies with her knowledge. If the master dies, his son cannot designate the maidservant as his wife, for she obtained her freedom at her master's death. 9. Designating a maidservant as a wife is equivalent to consecration, but not to marriage. Therefore, the husband may not become impure because of her. He does not inherit her estate, nor does he annul her vows until she enters the chuppah. Exodus 21:11 states, if he does not do any of these three for her, i.e. designate her as a wife for himself or his son, enable her to be redeemed by paying a reduced amount, she will be released without charge when she manifests signs of physical maturity, as we have explained, in addition to the way she can obtain her freedom as a Hebrew servant obtains his. 10. A master may not sell a Hebrew maidservant, nor may he give her as a gift to another person, regardless of whether or not he shares a family connection with him. If he sells her or gives her away, his deeds are of no consequence. As Exodus 21:8 states, he does not have the authority to sell her to a different man when he betrays her. Similarly, a master may not sell or give away a Hebrew servant to another person. It appears to me that the only reason the Torah has to state this explicitly with regard to a maidservant is that a master is able to designate her as a wife for her son. Therefore, it is necessary to say that he does not have the authority to sell her to a different man. 11. The Hebrew maidservant may not be sold to a person only when a marriage between her and either him or his son would be binding, so that she is fit to be designated as a wife. What is implied? A person may sell his daughter to his father For although the master may not designate her as a wife, she is fit to marry his son. For the maidservant is his brother's daughter. A person may not, however, sell his daughter to his son, for she is not fit to marry the master, for she is his master, nor is she fit to marry the master's son, for she is his father's sister. 12. A person may sell his daughter to certain individuals whom she is forbidden to marry, for instance, a widow to a high priest, or a divorcee, or a woman who underwent chalitza to an ordinary priest. For although marriage between such individuals is forbidden, the marriage is binding. 13. When a person consecrates his daughter when she was a minor and she becomes widowed or divorced, he cannot sell her as a maidservant afterwards. For a man may not sell his daughter as a maidservant unless after she has been married. He may, however, sell her as a maidservant after she has served as a maidservant. What is implied? The father sold her as a maidservant, then the master designated her as a wife. Afterwards, the master died and divorced her, but she returned to her father's domain because she is a minor. Her father may sell her a second time, even to a priest. Similarly, if she was widowed after being designated as a wife, and Yavin performed chalitza for her, the chalitza is unacceptable because she is a minor. She is nevertheless disqualified from marrying a priest. Even so, the father may sell her as a maidservant to a priest, because if he consecrated her, the marriage bond would be binding, as explained above. 14. When a person sells his daughter after she is released after serving 6 years, beyond the Jubilee year, or because he redeemed her by paying a prorated amount, he may sell her again if she is still a minor, as we have explained above. 15. The following laws apply when a person sells his daughter as a maidservant and then goes and consecrates her to another person. If the master desires to designate her as a wife, he may. If the master does not designate her as a wife, neither for himself nor for his son, when she leaves the master's domain, for her consecration to the other man is completed and she becomes his wife. 16. When a person sells his daughter as a maidservant but stipulates that the owner may not designate her as a wife, if the owner desires, he may designate her as a wife, for he has made a stipulation against what is written in the Torah. And whenever a person makes a stipulation against what is written in the Torah, his stipulation is nullified. Chapter 5. A Canaanite slave is acquired through 5 means and acquires his freedom through 3. He may be acquired through the transfer of money, the transfer of a deed of purchase, the manifestation of one's ownership, and or by drawing him after oneself. He acquires his freedom through the transfer of money, the transfer of a legal document, because of the loss of the tips of his limbs or organs. A Canaanite slave who is a minor is like an animal and is acquired by drawing him after oneself, as one draws an animal. We have already explained at the beginning of this book all the means by which a slave is acquired. 2. How can a Canaanite slave acquire himself through the transfer of money? When another person gave the slave's master money, telling him this is yours, with the intent that your slave be granted his freedom because of it. Once the master receives the money or the merchandise worth money, the slave is granted his freedom. There is no need for the slave to know of this matter, for it is his advantage to be released. And something that is to a person's advantage can be acquired in his behalf outside his presence. Similarly, if the slave can be freed if a person gives the slave money, specifying that it is given to him with the intent that he use it to obtain his freedom. Should the master desire to accept the money, the slave is granted his freedom. If the master does not desire to accept the money, it is not acquired by the slave, because it was given to him only with the intent that he purchase his freedom with it. Both money and merchandise worth money are effective in acquiring the slave or in acquiring his freedom. 3. How does one slave achieve his freedom? Through the transfer of a legal document. The master must write to him on a paper or on a shard, "Behold, you are a free man. Behold, you are your own property. I no longer have anything to do with you," or other statements that share this theme, for this is the primary content of a bill of release. Afterwards, he gives him the document in the presence of 2 witnesses. Similarly, if witnesses have signed on the bill of release and he gives the slave the bill of release in private, he attains his freedom, for the bill of release and his capacity to receive it came at the same time. Different will apply if the master tells the slave, "Behold, you are a free man. Behold, you are your own property," but does not write it in a document, even though witnesses testify in court that the master made such statements, and even if the master affirmed the statements with a king, his slave has not yet been freed. For a slave is not granted freedom except through the transfer of money, the transfer of a legal document, because of the loss of tips or of his limbs or organs. When a person writes in a legal document to his maidservant, "Behold, you are permitted to any man," his statement is of no consequence. For how is a slave released because of the loss of his tips of his limbs or organs? The person intentionally struck a slave and caused him to lose one of the 24 tips of his limbs or organs that will not regenerate. He is granted his freedom. A bill of release is required. If this applies to the 24 limbs, why does there explicitly mention a tooth and an eye to extrapolate from them? What characterizes the loss of an eye or a tooth? They are both obvious blemishes that will not be regenerated. So to all obvious blemishes that will not be regenerated cause a slave to be granted his freedom. If by contrast the master castrates his slave or cuts out his tongue, the slave is not granted his freedom, for these are not revealed blemishes. Similarly, a person knocks out one of the young slave's baby teeth, the slave is not released, for the tooth will grow back. Interestingly, they discovered in Japan some type of drug that actually enables your tooth to grow back. Well, it makes all your teeth grow back. So it would be interesting how that would apply to this halacha. 5. The only slaves released because of their loss of the tips of their limbs or organs are slaves that have been circumcised and immersed in a mikvah, for they are obligated in the presence of in observance of some of the mitzvahs. So a slave who was an outright Gentile is not released because of the loss of the tips of his limbs or organs. These are the tips of the limbs and organs that will not regenerate: the 10 fingers and the 10 toes, the tips of the ears, the tips of the nose, the tip of the male organ, the nipples of a woman's breasts. The eyes and the teeth are not included in this reckoning because they are explicitly mentioned in the Torah. 6, the slave possessed an extra finger and the master cut it off. The slave is released because of its loss if the finger is counted on his hand together with his other fingers. If the slave's eye was blinded and the master cut it out, the slave was released because of its loss if the master caused him the loss of an organ. The same law applies with regard to any other tips of the organs that are not functional and cannot be used for a task. If the master cuts it off, the master caused him the loss of an organ, and the slave is released because of its loss. 7, if the master struck the servant on his eye and blinded him, or on his ear and made him deaf, the slave is released because of it. If, however, the master struck the slave near his eye and afterwards he no longer saw, or near his ear and he no longer heard, the servant is not released because of this. 8, the following rules apply. If the master struck his slave on his eye and reduced its sight, or struck him on his tooth and caused it to wobble, the slave can use these organs, he is not released. If not, he is released. 9, the following rules apply. If the slave's eye was not functioning well and he saw with difficulty, the slave's tooth was wobbly and the master struck him and knocked out the wobbly tooth or blinded the weak eye. If the slave was able to use these organs beforehand at all, he is granted his freedom because of their loss. If not, he is not granted his freedom. 10, if the master struck the slave in his hand and it became swollen but would ultimately return to its normal state, the slave is not released because of it. If the master pulled out the slave's beard and in doing so dislocated his jawbone, the slave is granted his freedom because the master has nullified the use of the teeth that are located in that bone. 11, if the master knocked out the slave's tooth or blinded his eye unintentionally, for instance, he threw a stone at an animal, hit the slave, and knocked out his tooth or cut his finger, he is not released. This is alluded to by Exodus 21:27, which states that we will knock out his slave's or his maidservant's tooth. The wording implies that he must do so intentionally. 12, if the master inserted his hand into the womb of his maidservant and blinded the eye of the fetus within, he is not granted his freedom, for he did not know anything of the entity so that he could intend to strike it. We'll not look into any investigations into what was going on there. Okay. 13. If the slave's master was a physician and the slave told him, treat my eye for me, and he blinded it. Hollow out my tooth for me, and he knocked it out. The slave tricked the master and is granted his freedom, for although he did not have the intent of injuring the slave, he did not intend to touch the slave's limbs. He did intend to touch the slave's limbs and became endangered because of them. Needless to say, if the slave's eye was hurting and the master was a bloodletter and removed it for him, the slave is granted his freedom. 14. When a person knocks out the tooth of a slave and then blinds his eye, he must grant the slave his freedom because of his tooth and pay him the damages for his eye. The same principles applies in all analogous situations. 15. When a person is half a slave and half a free man, he is jointly owned by two masters, he does not receive his freedom because of the loss of the tips of his limbs or organs. The rationale is that he is not the sole property of the master who injured him. 16. The slaves that belong to a wife are considered as Saint Barzil. The slaves that belong to a wife and are considered as Saint Barzil are released because of the loss of the tips of their limbs or organs if the husband injures them, but not if the wife injures them. The slaves that belong to a wife and are considered as Nechsei Melug are not released because of the loss of the tips of the limbs or organs, neither if the husband injures them, for he owns merely the use of them, nor if the wife injures them, for they are not solely hers. 17. The release of slaves because of the loss of tips of the limbs or organs is practiced in every place and in every time. This ruling may be delivered only by judges who possess smicha. For this is a fine. For this reason, if a servant told his master, you knocked out my tooth and blinded my eye, and the master admits doing this, the master is not liable. The rationale is that had he taken the initiative and admitted having caused this injury, he would not be liable to grant the slave his freedom unless witnesses testify. For a person who admits his guilt in a case requiring a fine is not liable, as Hilchos Geneva states. For anyone who admits his guilt in a case requiring a fine is not liable. Chapter 6:1. When a person composes a bill of release for a slave and gives it to another person to acquire on the slave's behalf, saying, take possession of this bill of release for so-and-so my slave, the slave is granted his freedom even though the bill of release did not reach his hand, for it is possible to acquire something of benefit to a person outside his presence. If, however, a person said, give this bill of release to my slave, he may not retract it, but the slave does not retain his freedom until the bill of release reaches his hand. Therefore, if a person says, give this bill of release to my slave and dies, it should not be given to him after his master's death. 2. When a person composes a legal document saying, I made my slave so-and-so a free man, my servant so-and-so was made a free man, or he is a free man, he is released. If whoever the document states, I will make him a free man, he is not released. 3. When a master states that he released a slave and the slave denies being released, we suspect that the master had another person acquire the bill of release on behalf of the slave. If the master composed the bill of release and gave it to the slave says, you neither wrote it nor gave it to me, the statement of a principal is considered to be the equivalent of testimony of 100 witnesses, and is considered a slave until he is freed in the presence of witnesses. 4. When a person commands at the time of his death, my heirs should not subjugate so-and-so my maidservant, she is still considered a maidservant as before, but it is forbidden for his heir to subjugate her, for it is a mitzvah to fulfill the words of a deceased person. Similarly, if a dying man says, generate satisfaction for so-and-so my maidservant, we compel the heirs not to make her perform any tasks other than the ones she desires to perform. If he commanded them to free her, we compel them to free her. These past two halachas, we had a very similar one last week. 5. There are 6 matters in which a bill of release given to a servant is equivalent to a bill of divorce. With regard to other matters, a bill of release is equivalent to other legal documents. These are the 6. A. They are not acceptable if prepared by Gentile legal authorities. B. They are acceptable if one witness is a kuti. If one witness is a kuti, 6, they must be written for the sake of the slave who was being freed. D, they may not be written on an article that is attached to the ground. E, the witnesses may sign only in the presence of each other. And F, the same laws apply to a bill of divorce and a bill of release with regard to bringing these legal documents from one place to another. 6, what is implied? All legal documents that are composed by Gentile legal authorities are acceptable provided they conform to all the conditions stated in Hilchos Halva, with the exception of bills of divorce for women and bills of release for slaves. Any legal document that is signed by even one witness who was a kuti is not acceptable, with the exception of bills of divorce for women and bills of release for slaves, provided the kuti is known to be precise in his observance. In the present age, when the kutim are considered as Gentiles with regard to all matters, we apply the laws stated with regard to them to the Sadducees. For the Sadducees in the present era are considered like the kutim of the previous era. Before it was decreed they would be considered like Gentiles. With regard to a woman's bill of divorce, Deuteronomy 24:1 states, and he shall write to her, which is interpreted by our sages to mean for her sake. And with regard to candidate maidservant's bill of divorce, Leviticus 19:2 states, nor was freedom given to her, teaching that the bill of release must be written for her sake. With regard to a woman's bill of divorce, Ibid 1:3 states, and he shall write and he shall give, which is interpreted by our sages to mean that the bill of divorce should be written on the substance that is lacking only to be given. This excludes a bill of divorce that is written while the article on which it is written is attached and afterwards detached, for it is lacking both being attached and being given. Similarly, with regard to the bill of release that is written given to her, teaching that the bill of release should be lacking only being given. Witnesses may not sign bills of divorce for women and bills of release for slaves outside each other's presence. We have already explained that reason for this ruling in Hilchos Gerushin. 7. What is meant by the statement that the same law applied to the bill of divorce and bills of release with regard to bringing these legal documents from one place to another? When an agent brings a bill of divorce of release from one place to another in Eretz Yisrael, he does not have to testify that it was written and signed in his presence. And in the diaspora, if there are no witnesses present to verify the authenticity of the bill of release, and the agent states that it was written and signed in his presence, its authenticity is considered as verified. Afterwards, if the master comes and protests, no attention is paid to him, as we have explained with regard to a bill of divorce. Just as when a woman brings her bill of divorce, she does not have the authenticity of the document. She does not have to have the authenticity of the document verified, because the bill of divorce is in her possession. So too, when a servant's bill of release is in his possession, he doesn't have to have the authenticity of the document verified, just as the woman must say it is written and signed in my presence when it was stipulated that she do so, as we have explained in that context. So too, when a servant brings his bill of release and states it is written and signed in my presence, his word is accepted in the same way, and he does not have to have the authenticity of this document verified. 8. Everyone who is acceptable to bring a bill of divorce to a woman as the husband's agent is also acceptable to bring a bill of release for a slave as the agent of the master. A slave may receive a bill of release for another slave from that master's slave, but not from his own master. When an owner writes a legal document with which he seeks to consecrate his candidate maidservant, even though he tells her, attain your freedom by virtue of this document to become consecrated because of it, this expression is not one that conveys freedom, for she is neither consecrated nor freed.